All right, so welcome to another episode of In Conversation With, and this time we've got our good friend Vicki Cheung, who is the CTO of Stealth, a stealthy startup that we might get a little bit of insights into later on. But Vicki's also had a really illustrious career. She's worked at Lyft, OpenAI, started up things at Duolingo, and we're going to dig into all of these things because it's really impressive the amount that she's achieved, and this is kind of like the purpose of In Conversation With. It's been able to kind of bring the human, demystify the way that they kind of got through their career, and to hopefully help you all out with your careers too. So Vicki, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, so the first question, what we generally time to dig into is like people's background. Now, what was it that kind of first got you interested in computer science? Why did you kind of decide that would be a thing to study?
So I think it started when I was in elementary school, like probably around 10. So I grew up in Hong Kong, and so right around the time when I was 10, they started actually having like computer classes in public schools. So the first year curriculum was something like, have you guys heard of like logo? Like I just associate it with like, oh yeah, drawing the thing. So we like learned that, and we had to make like HTML websites. And because like I went to a public school, we didn't really have any like fancy software. So we had to like actually write the HTML like by hand. Nice. And I guess like I thought that was like actually really fun and empowering in one way, because I was like, oh, I'm just like this 10-year-old kid, but I can like, you know, sign up for like GeoCity or whatever, and then like put on this website. And then it's like, oh, people don't know that I'm just 10. So it just kind of like, I think kind of snowballed from there, where I started like making, I guess like the next thing was like probably like PHP sites or something, and then sort of like going further down the rabbit hole. And I didn't really think that hard about what I wanted to do, because it just seemed so natural that like, oh, this is the thing that I like enjoy spending my free time on. And it also happens to be like a thing I can study and like be a profession. And so, yeah, it really, there wasn't really a lot of like sort of wondering about it, I guess, in my mind.
You kind of, you started off and you're looking at HTML, and I think HTML was fascinating too, because it, as you said, it gives you the ability to create this thing on this internet thing that's public, and that's pretty amazing. Where did the kind of the depth come from? Because the thing is, when you start to look at your career and you're looking at things like you're doing with Duolingo, you're not so much kind of working with the PHP in the front end, or is you kind of like starting to dig deeper? You're going deeper into or systems programming and things like that. Was there something that kind of made you turn direction, that you kind of think, oh, this is actually really interesting, this depth or complexity?
Yeah, well, I actually kind of really see myself as like a generalist, because I find all things engineering very fascinating. I really like making websites and making things beautiful. Like, I think that's such a joy, but I also really like digging into systems and understanding like the intricacies and everything. Like when, I guess like the first time I really thought about systems was probably like when I was in high school. So I was like really a big nerd, I guess. I like kept going down this like engineering rabbit hole. So I would like buy college computer science textbooks, and I would just like read them and do the exercises. So I like, yeah, bought this like systems book that I actually eventually used in college. And yeah, I just went into like, oh, how like, you know, all the system pieces work. And yeah, I thought that was like super fascinating too.
It's definitely, I think when I was sort of researching through some of the things that you've done, and there's definitely been some twists and turns, and I'm looking forward to getting into those. But let's start at the start. Duolingo. Now, Duolingo is a great platform. You kind of started off there when it was literally just founding out. How did you get that role? Tell us about how you got the role, what you did there.
Yeah, I would say everything that happened was very much kind of a combination of like being at the right place at the right time, and also kind of, you know, I guess proactively seeking out the things that I like to do. So I guess like to go back to the very beginning, Duolingo started out of CMU, Carnegie Mellon University, which is where I went for college. And yeah, it all kind of was like, I would say it was a single decision that like really changed the course of like my life and my career, which is when I was in high school, I went to like a summer camp at CMU where I was like taking some college classes, and they told me to just stay. So I like dropped out of high school and just like started college because I was like, oh, I think this is what I like to do. And then when I was in college, I would like seek out these like professors I really enjoyed working with. And I was like, oh, can I like, work with you on like research or whatnot? And so one of them was Luis Fonan, who was, one of the professors in like my freshman courses. And he was like, oh yes, actually I'm working on this thing called like Duolingo. It's like between me and my PhD student, Severin. And, we got a couple other like people like, interns and other students working on it. And I was like, sure, it sounds good. And so I like started doing that like as an internship. And the first task, I still remember the first day I showed up at like, I guess it was still a campus office then. There was this like giant NLP book on my desk, and they're like, okay, can you just like read about, like speech recognition and work on our speech recognition engine. And I was like a junior at high school or in college at the time. And I was like, sure, that sounds fun. So that's what I spent my summer on. And then, yeah, we just really, enjoyed working together as a team. And I was like, oh, this seems like a really, a mission for a company that really resonates with me. And so I was like, I'll just stick around. Yeah, so I kept working, I guess, like part-time throughout my senior year. And then shortly after that, we raised funding and like spun out as a company. So long story short, that's sort of how I got there. And I guess the other thing about like what I worked on there is a little bit of everything, because like when you're one of like the first people in a company, you just kind of like do whatever needs to be done to, ship the thing. So after speech recognition, I actually went on to work on like mostly full stack stuff. Like I built a lot of the web front end, and then like wrote the Android app and did like a lot of the API layer stuff also. And kind of like, I guess over the course of a few years, drifted lower and lower into the stack, but I would say very much like kind of all over the place.
You're an incredible engineer, and that goes without sort of saying. But do you attribute some of the knowledge, a lot of the kind of the understanding, the knowledge that you've picked up over the years, because of that attitude of like wanting to know how everything works, being able to, wanting to kind of like dig in and do a little bit of everything, understand how the API side works, but also have an understanding how the front end works. How do you feel that kind of like, does it give you additional sympathy, say when you're working on a back end, that you have sort of mechanical sympathy for how the front end works, or for front end devs? Is there a beneficial thing, do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think, a lot of, what different areas of the stack is optimizing for is like kind of different. And if you don't know what the person you're working with is optimizing for, it's very hard to kind of work effectively as a team, I think. So even if you've never like personally experienced like, doing front end and stuff, I think it does help to, just ask them, what are you optimizing for? And kind of like, build empathy that way. But certainly having been in their shoes, I'm like, oh yeah, I know this is like a really hard thing to do for you. So I'm going to like try to build it, as much as I can to ease your pain.
What sort of advice would you give companies when they're trying to retrain their staff? So you've touched on things like education and growth and stuff. Is there anything specific as an employee, as specifically when you're at that junior marginal moving over to the mid tier and upwards, that you could give to organizations to help retain great people?
Yeah, I think, everybody is a little different. Like everybody has sort of different priorities in their career. And I would say the first thing you need to do is understand those priorities. Like, I think, when I was managing, I would have like fairly regular sort of career check-ins with people, just like, what are you thinking about your career? What do you want to work on like in the next quarter that would make you feel like you're really, satisfying your career sort of goals, and sort of try to help them find those opportunities in the company. And I do think that sometimes the right answer is for people to leave a company and like experience something else. But I think a lot of times, companies don't even like explicitly ask that question for people, like, what do you want in your career? And so it's very easy to lose people that way.
So for me, whenever I've moved on to a different company, I've just had this feeling that it was time to go. I've never really taken a measured approach to it. And that's probably because I'm not so smart. But do you think there is like a measured way that as a growing developer that you kind of need to, how do you kind of weigh up the decision of stay or go? Do you think, is there a formula or some advice that you'd be able to give folks who are maybe stuck in that?
I mean, I think a lot of times it is a feeling, like your intuition can tell you a lot, like before you maybe even know about it, and and be able to articulate the reasons. But I also think that there are a few things that can help. Like, as I've kind of moved through the companies, I always start with like, I guess like when I'm deciding where to go next, I have a list of goals in mind. And when I start at the company, I just like very explicitly, tell my manager, like, these are my goals. These are the reasons I started at this company. And I want to be able to meet these goals in whatever time frame.
Yeah, but I think one of the interesting things I saw in your career, which was to move from, let's say, from the company we were talking about, True Vault, to OpenAI, and I think you did move roles. Like, you went from, like, I guess traditional, software engineering into infrastructure. And I know, like, we've talked about this in the past. Like, you really indulged into the infrastructure side of things. And so what prompted that change in moving from True Vault to OpenAI?
Yeah, I think it was kind of sort of similar of like, I got connected with the people who eventually started OpenAI while I was at True Vault. And, the mission really resonated with me. And I felt like I could just learn a lot there. It was like very, very different from working at a startup where, you have your microservices, you have like your website, you have just like, I'm not trying to like trivialize or generalize like people's stack, but it's like there's certainly like a certain way that you build startups or products that I think is very different from the way you build infrastructure and whatnot for a more sort of R&D focused team. And so I feel like that was going to be an interesting change for me, and I just wanted to see what's up. So so I, as I started talking with the team there, I guess like it was another one of those where like the company wasn't even like formed yet. So it was just like me and Greg Brockman working in like his apartment. And yeah, I didn't really like actively decide that I like was going to spend full time on like infrastructure. It was more just like, again, there's only two of us. One of us will have to do it. So, so we ended up, we ended up actually both kind of doing it. Another funny story about that was when I interviewed at OpenAI, they didn't really have an interview process or anything. So Greg was like, so I tried setting up this Kubernetes cluster and it's like not working. Can you fix it? And that was the interview. And I had never even heard of Kubernetes before because it was like pretty young. It was like version 1 or something. And definitely hadn't used like Terraform before that. So it was like, okay, a lot of new stuff. This looks fun. So yeah, just like got in, got my hands dirty, started like TCP dumping all over the place because I was like, they're not talking. And yeah, at the end of the interview, I guess like, kind of got something working, and then I was hired, and that ended up being, kind of a major theme in that role. So.
That is super cool. Yeah, I mean, so I think that's like the most organic way of starting a company is to just talk about problems that you have today, and then hopefully find people that can fill in those roles. I think, but like thinking about this, right? Like you're a software engineer, now doing infrastructure stuff. Of course, you're learning about new technologies like Kubernetes, schedulers, and networking, and how does that all work? Do you think there is a need for software engineers to learn more and more about the underlying infrastructure? Do you think, is it better to have just software engineers just focus on code and leave the infrastructure things to, experts like who are doing networking and who are SREs, hired into those roles? Do you think there is a benefit of being well-rounded in that way?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a spectrum. Like, it's hard to say where software ends and infrastructure starts these days. Certainly like, if you work on Kubernetes, like, is that software engineering? I think it is. It's software engineering, in a very infrastructure heavy area. So yeah, I guess that's maybe like one observation. But yeah, I do think that like, at least, the hope is that more and more people can get started with software engineering without knowing too much about the stack. And I mean, already like with the cloud, you're like shielded from like a lot of, hardware stuff. And so I feel like that layers, keeps getting pushed higher and higher. But I do think it is beneficial. It might be like my personal bias from, working in like smaller teams, but like, I think it does help to like, after a certain point, maybe not when you're like prototyping or just like shipping your first product or something, but after a certain point, like you start to run into maybe bottlenecks or like, different constraints in your designs that you might not be able to really pinpoint or debug without knowing the infrastructure. So yeah, I think certainly you can get away with doing a lot without knowing, but after a certain point, I think it's useful.
So like, do you have any tips for people that are thinking to do this transition, moving from software, like I guess more traditional software engineering role to a more, SRE or operation engineering roles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing is to try doing it and see if you like it. Like, I think it is, kind of a little different. Like, yeah, there are times when you are, writing code or building pieces on top of whatever Kubernetes or something. Like, that's certainly, I think to people who are more used to like building products, like maybe that's the kind of a workflow that looks very similar, but there are also other times when it feels like you're, spending a lot of time building up a pretty massive mental model of what's going on in the system and trying to put the pieces together in like just the right way. And I think that, not everyone enjoys that kind of Lego building. So I think, playing around with it will help. I think another thing is, do you like thinking about failure cases? Do you like thinking about like reliability and security and all that stuff? Like, are those the kind of things that you like to seek out and, and fix proactively? If so, then maybe there is a future for you in like operations or SRE.
So then it was interesting. You moved to Lyft, right? And I think you were leading us, I guess, a software engineering team at Lyft. Was that like, again, like you moved away from infrastructure? It looks like maybe not. Could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, I think it was another one of those moments where I sort of took a step back and was like, what kind of impact do I want to have in like the next few years in my career? And decided that like, I really cared about helping people grow, and I find a lot of satisfaction from that. And further, I think like creating a good work environment where people like sort of enjoy going to work. And I feel like as a manager, that's really your responsibility to make a good environment for your team. I also feel like I wanted to spend some time working on like diversity and inclusion issues in tech. And I think as a manager, you get to spend a lot of time doing that because you're sort of responsible for the culture. And so all those things led me to like, oh, let me try doing engineering management for a few years. And yeah, I think it was still fairly deep in infrastructure. I was leading the compute team at Lyft, where we were building out the Kubernetes platform for Lyft. So yeah, there was certainly a lot of like talking together sort of as a team on like what architecture, what the architecture should look like, and how do we get the whole company onto Kubernetes? Like what's the scale and so on. So yeah, there's definitely like, I guess in the great spectrum of like engineering management, it was like, it was one that was maybe closer to the technical side than not, but still, yeah, I really enjoyed it.
All right, so I think I really enjoyed talking to you, Vicki. But like, I think I want to ask this last question, like the present of like what you're doing. I know like you left Lyft shortly after they IPO'd to start your own company. It's a stealth. Of course, you can't share too many details, but we would love for you to share some of the kind of the high level details of what you're working on today.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I learned at OpenAI was, how much the infrastructure experience sucks for, things that are not core software engineering. So what I would say is like, if you look at building infrastructure for like machine learning or something, there are a lot of hurdles to kind of getting it right, because it's such a sort of intersectional sort of area where you have to know about like the constraints of machine learning, and you have to be able to build large scale systems. And I think it's just like, when I look at how we built our infrastructure at OpenAI, it feels like we were always going against the current, because whatever was being built, like Kubernetes at the time was heavily optimized for sort of stateless microservices, which was not at all what we were doing. And so it was always like, oh, trying to make the infrastructure do the thing that's not built to do. And so that kind of got me further down into this like, intersectional area of like machine learning and infrastructure, and thinking about all the like difficulties people have for building like nice platforms for doing these sorts of workloads. And then I guess like looking at the problem generally of like, what are the problems that machine learning engineers are actually like running into, to see where infrastructure can help. And so really studying a lot about like what, the users are doing. And I guess long story short, my co-founder and we met at OpenAI, and he's from the ML research side. So we kind of partner up and have like, the totally different backgrounds. I think makes a very good team for understanding both sides of the spectrum. And sort of realizing that the number one problem people have is that machine learning engineers have very basic questions about like the machine learning models in production that they can't really answer. So for example, like how healthy is my model? Or like if you think about maybe if you think about like the world in software engineering before there's like great observability tools, for example, people are like scared to deploy because like, oh, I don't know if this will break something. Even today, people are like, don't deploy on Friday because like, I don't want to deal with that. So if you think about that, but like, 10 times worse or 100 times worse for machine learning, then you get to a place where machine learning engineers aren't deploying models for like maybe a whole year because they're like, I don't want to touch that. Like, I don't, if I upgraded this library, I don't know if the performance will change, and they have no great way to tell. So that was really like, I guess, the genesis of a lot of what we're thinking about building is giving people that feedback loop of like, what is happening in production. And I think more generally is sort of like, I like to think about it as bringing the disciplines and the sort of lessons that we learned from software engineering into machine learning engineering. Like, what have we built up in terms of tooling in software engineering that doesn't quite work yet for machine learning, but that we could make it work if we sort of change our mental model a little bit on like what software is. So that's sort of the larger mission.
That's fascinating. And I'm wishing you the best on that. And I'm looking forward to you inviting Mishra and I over to San Francisco to have a little drink for your IPO party. We'd love we love a free sandwich and a glass of tea. No, seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously,
I can't wait to see
genuinely,
you in person.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's been so long, hasn't it? I mean, I'm hoping KubeCon's going to go ahead in the fall this year, and we'll all be able to at least sort of hang out for a little bit and just kind of meet in person again, which is, it's been quite sort of, personally speaking, quite draining not being able to do that. But last question, all good things have to come to an end. And I'm super interested in knowing whether Vicki has a long-term plan. Like, where do you see yourself in 20 years?
Yeah, well, I don't really have a plan per se, because I feel like 20 years ago, I couldn't have predicted that I would be here. And so I just don't feel like I can make very good predictions about that. But I do have sort of general wishes. Yeah, so one is I just like know that in my core being, I like engineering and I like building and stuff. And I don't know, I think, I hope that in 20 years, I'll have found like meaningful ways to apply that sort of skill and knowledge to some problem in the world that I like really, really care about. And yeah, I think another thing is like 20 years is a long time. I think the sad thing is like, there are times when it becomes like really hard to be a woman in tech, and I feel like a lot of women in tech leave for different reasons. So like 20 years is kind of like a long time, and unfortunately we do see a lot of women leave in that time scale. So I guess what I hope is that I'll still be in tech, and that I'll be part of making it a better place for other women to come.
Well, I'm hoping that one morning I'm going to pick up my newspaper, I'm going to be sitting with my coffee, and I'm going to be reading the headline which features you, and I can turn around and say, oh my gosh, it's Vicki. I knew it. She'd do it. She's done it. I know this lady. She's incredible. And that'll make me super happy as well. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you, Vicki. You are going to do it. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And on that, unfortunately, we've got to go. And I've really enjoyed talking with Vicki always. And I really want to thank you so much for taking the time out, sharing your insights. I really think it's beneficial for folks to learn from others when they're trying to like forge their own career paths, because it's really not an easy thing to do. It's not really written down, and very, very valuable insights you've provided. And thank you again so much for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.